Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Ask the Organic Guy. This is a segment where I get to answer some of the most asked questions on the internet. And today I want us to answer the question, what is the difference between organic and conventional farming? All right, and if you look at the internet, it doesn't really help us in defining the difference. And my goal by the end of this video is to really help you see the clear difference between organic and conventional farming. And for us, the best place really to start is by looking at how are each farming system defined, right? So for example, one, organic is defined as a farming system that avoids the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and GMOs, right? This is how the internet defines what organic is. When it comes to conventional, the internet defines conventional as a farming system that uses heavy machinery, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and GMOs, right? So basically, if you look at from this definition, it doesn't really give us any useful information that we can, by definition, by distinction, really tell the difference between these two farming systems. And by the end of this video, I'm going to give you my definition of how I define organic and how I define conventional. You'll be able to actually compare and see how useful my definition can be, especially in the long term. So from this, basically, if someone asked you based in this definition, we'll tell them that organic is a farming system that avoids the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and GMO. Conventional farming is a farming system that uses synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, and GMO. So basically, this is where the conventional educational system, this is where conventional knowledge comes to an end. That's one way we can do that. Another way we can actually use to define the difference between organic and conventional is by looking at their practices. What does each farming system do? Or what does each farming system believe in? So we have organic versus conventional. And I want us to really tell the difference using three main areas or three main philosophies. One is, how does each farming system talk about soil and fertility? Number two, how does each farming system treat pests and diseases? And three, how does each farming system treat when it comes to nature? How does each farming system look at nature? So first of all, for soil fertility, we do know how organic farming treats the soil, right? Organic farming believes that the soil is a living entity. Well, how do we know that? By how it treats the soil. Why? It supplies it with living organisms like compost, right? I'm not sure if some of you have actually ever touched compost, but it's full of living organisms, okay? The only way you can be able to do that is if you believe that the soil is a living entity, hence you can supply it with living organisms, right? Number two, of course, the soil, organic farmers supply the soil with green manure and animal manure. All these are living organisms. These are living organisms that are being supplied to the soil in order to enrich it. As a result, organic farmers do also use organic fertilizers. And what do organic fertilizers do? Well, they actually help cultivate life in the soil. How? I'm sure if you've ever seen organic fertilizers, they are actually full of life. And that is exactly how they do. So from an organic farming perspective, when it comes to soil and soil fertility, organic does treat soil as a living entity and does treat fertility as a way to cultivate life in the soil. So how does conventional agriculture treat the soil? Well, hear this. I'm not sure if it actually considered the soil as a living entity, but we can actually judge it by what it does to the soil. What does conventional agriculture do? Well, it supplies it with synthetic fertilizers. And what do synthetic fertilizers to do the soil? Of course, they increase soil fertility, making it very hard for life to survive there, and hence, of course, it kills the soil. Okay, what does What does conventional agriculture do to the soil? Well, it uses heavy machines that ultimately compacts the soil and kills the soil. What about when it comes to pests and diseases? What does each farming system believes about pests and diseases? Well, organic farmers believe in managing pests and diseases. And how do they do that? Well, they provide an enabling environment for them to be able to control pests and diseases. How do they do that? By providing an enabling environment for predators to be able to thrive. When it comes to pests and diseases, organic farmers practice things like crop rotation, which disrupts pests and diseases cycles and hence actually help in managing pests and diseases. As a last result, organic farmers do use organic pesticides. Some of the pesticides like neem and pyrethrins actually have something like 40 minutes to 10 days half-lives. And all these pesticides are actually easily digestible by the microorganisms in the soil. So they don't really cause a lot of damage to the soil. How do conventional farming systems treat pests and diseases? Well, we know because of how they treat it. They use toxic chemicals. In fact, one of the most toxic chemicals ever created, like glyphosate, right, which is a known carcinogen, to control pests and diseases. How does organic treat nature, right? Organic does believe in the philosophy of working with nature rather than against it. And how does it do that? Well, if you walk into organic farming, you'll always see a lot of biodiversity. You won't see a farmer just basically growing one crops for the entire area, right? They always try and mix up. And why? Well, because if you have a lot of biodiversity, that means you will be able to have a lot of life within that ecosystem. How does conventional farming system treat nature? Well, they see it as a barrier to their productivity. That's why every single time where they go to do conventional farming, they actually shade down all other living organisms in there so that they can create what we call monocultures. And what do they do in the process? Well, they do a lot of killing. So if we actually try and differentiate organic and conventional system based on what they do, based on their practices, it becomes very clear. And there are really two ways of how I look at this. One is, of course, if you look at organic prioritizes biology. How does it do that? Well, biology is basically the study of living things. Well, it does that by, instead of using synthetic fertilizers, it uses living, right? Organic, bio fertilizers in the soil. So it very much prioritizes biology. But when it comes to conventional actually prioritizes chemistry, right? If you look at even at the time of providing fertility into the soil, what does it do? Well, it just says our plants need NPK, and that is what we're going to supply it with. So it's very much, organic is about prioritizing the biological part of farming, especially in the soil, while conventional farming system is about prioritizing the chemistry part, especially in the soil. Another way you can look at the difference between organic and conventional is that organic cultivates life, while conventional farming system facilitates death. This is how I actually like to look at the two farming systems when it comes to their differences. Organic in one hand cultivates life, conventional in the other hand facilitates death. And you don't have to take my word for it, you just have to look at their practices. Well, how does organic cultivate life? Well, it does so by providing the soil with living fertility, okay, like compost, like green manure, like animal manure. How does organic cultivate life? Well, it does so by providing an enabling environment for predators to be able to control pests and diseases, right? How does it promote, how does this cultivate life? Well, it does so by promoting biodiversity, which eventually cultivates life. When we look at the other end, actually, how does conventional farming facilitate death? Well, we know they use synthetic fertilizers, and we know what synthetic fertilizers do to the soil. They actually kill the soil, making it very hard for living organisms to survive there. How do conventional systems approach pests and disease control? Well, we know they use the most lethal pesticides that are available, carcinogenic pesticides, to control pests and diseases. And in the process, they do what? They facilitate death. And when it comes to nature, how does conventional farming do that? Well, we do know they practice monocultures, and in the process killing everything in there just to grow one crop, and in the process facilitating death. And that is actually a scientific part, and that's a scientific approach to how you can tell the difference between these two farming systems. There is also a historical approach on how you can do this and actually tell the difference between how organic cultivates life and how conventional agriculture facilitates death. A lot of agricultural companies are used today in terms of providing farmers with inputs were actually involved during the World War in providing raw materials for the warlord during the First and Second World War. Companies like Bayer were involved in the production of an insecticide called Zyklon B. This is the same insecticides that was used by the Nazis during the World War II to actually commit the Holocaust against the Jews. Okay? Another company you might know about, Syngenta, okay, is another company that was used during the World War to actually produce pesticides. And in this case, Syngenta produced a pesticide called DDT. DDT is actually a dioxin, one of the most toxic pesticide that you will ever come across. It's an endocrine disruptor. It's also carcinogenic. Thank God there was an amazing work that was done by Rachel Carson in a book, The Silent Spring, that actually brought these particular pesticides into light. And they were eventually banned, especially in the United States in 1972. Right, here's another company you might know about, Dow Chemicals. Was also used in producing synthetic chemicals during the World War. They produced something called Agent Orange. This is the same chemicals that were used by the US Army during the Vietnam War. And guess what? Over 5 million people were affected. Up until today, actually, a lot of the people in Vietnam cannot grow anything. Why? Because this chemical Agent Orange is still very predominant in the soil. So if you have to grow anything, you basically be eating Agent Orange. A lot of the babies also that are being born in Vietnam have a lot of genetic defects, mainly contributed to this chemical here, Agent Orange. So if you look from a scientific point of view, conventional farming system does facilitate death. Okay, if you look from a historical point of view, conventional farming system does indeed facilitate death. And I promised you that during the beginning was to give you my definition of how I like to define these two farming systems. Well, I define organic farming system as a farming system that cultivates life, and I define conventional farming system as a farming system that facilitates death. All right, so I hope this kind of definition makes sense. Let me know if there's something I left out or if there's something you like to add. I'm very, very much appreciative. Till the next one, remember to be organic. Cheers.